Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining. Lloyd, the floor is yours. Let's talk more about strategies around multi-version support. Please save your questions for afterwards. There will be 10 minutes reserved for asking questions. So, go ahead.
All right. Hello. My name is Lloyd McKenzie. Some of you have heard of me. If you've been on chat.fhir.org, you've probably seen me answer a question or two. I'm a consultant for Dogwood, but most relevant in terms of today's presentation is I'm one of the deputy technical directors for Da Vinci, which is an accelerator in the US that does a whole bunch of things with payers, and subject to various US regulations. And that caused us to have to do a bit of a deep dive into the joys of trying to support multiple versions. So we're going to go through a few things. We're going to talk about where versioning fits into the FHIR space in general. We'll talk about why and where you might want to care about multiple version support, either because you have to do it now or because you anticipate perhaps needing to do it later. And if you're not in the first boat, you're in the second boat, even if you don't realize it. And then we'll look at two different types of multi-version support. Multi-version support for the core specification, so STU 3, R4, R5, R6, R27, whatever it ends up being. And as well, support for implementation guide versions where you might have a parent IG or a whole ancestry tree of implementation guides that you depend on and needing to deal with multiple versions of those. And look at some of the approaches and then some of the problems that they don't fix that you're just going to have to deal with, at least unless somebody invents better technologies or better approaches than we've come up with so far. When we have a successful specification, it tends to evolve because people have feedback, they want things to be fixed, they want things to be enhanced, and whenever you do that, we end up publishing another version. So every time we put out another version, it means that there is less likelihood that all of your communication partners are going to be on the same version that you are, unless a given version is so horrible that nobody uses it, which occasionally happens. It also means that the communication partners that you have that are on the same version that you are less likely to stay there because there's all of these newer, more exciting things that they may find themselves wanting to shift to, and that can also create an issue. So things that are working well may cease working well going forward. And as a designer, somebody who's writing a specification, you could just write a different version of your specification for every different version that you want to depend on, but we're all lazy and we don't want to do that. And for those of you who are not in the writing the specifications phase, but in the reading and trying to build the specifications phase, you don't want to write code for all of those. So you would ideally like to have a single specification that supports all of the different communication environments that you're faced with. And so the question is, how do we do that? We see this in the core specification. So we have various versions of FHIR Core. We don't really have any implementations of DSTU 1 out there in the wild anymore. We still have a few DSTU 2, but mostly we are a little bit of STU 3, lots and lots and lots of R4, a little bit of R5, and the prospect of R6, which will either be just as popular as R4 or more so, or won't be popular at all, and we don't know for sure. Then we've got foundational guides. So things like US Core, Canadian Core, Australian Core, etc. But there's also other guides, things like structured data capture, QI Core, patient summary, patient access, all of these other foundational guides that we want to align with and they are continuing to put out new versions and occasionally break things and certainly add new features. And when I'm building a particular solution space implementation guide, whether that's for cancer or physical activity or whatever it might be, I kind of want to align with a bunch of these things. And they all have a whole bunch of different versions that I have to worry about. When we're talking about versions, we typically care about things like what's the version of the profile, what's the version of the value set, what's the version of the operation. In practice, most systems or most authors, when they publish content, they put the same version number on everything. So whether you have changed it or not, it's going to end up with a new version when that content gets put out there, because it's really, really hard as an author to keep track of what exactly has changed, and has the change been substantive or not? Should it be a minor version increment for this profile? Because what if its dependencies are changed? What if the value set has changed? And so it's just easiest to just stamp a new version on the entire collection. What that means is that the fact that you have a version change doesn't necessarily mean that the piece of the specification that you care about has changed at all, or at least not changed in a way that matters to you. We do use semantic versioning within HL7 international publications. We strongly recommend that for everybody else, but there's no requirement to do it. If we were starting today, we probably would have instituted a requirement to do it, because that would have made life easier for everybody, but we didn't realize it at the time. And so you can, if you're using semantic versioning, you can look at the version number and see, is it a major change or a minor change, or is it a patch release, which theoretically means that there's no significant change in terms of interoperability. But that's for the IG as a whole, and doesn't tell you what's happened with respect to any particular artifact within that. And even at that level, there isn't broad agreement on what constitutes major versus minor. So your ability to look at the version number and say, how does this impact me, is negligible. You have to actually look at the artifacts that you care about and compare them. Now, there are comparison tools that are out there. Graham's put together some. There's others that have been produced as well. They're not necessarily pretty, but they're a heck of a lot better than bringing everything up side by side and manually comparing. So you do have that available, but right now, the only analytics process that we can count on, particularly given that text can change, is to have a human brain go and look at it and say, does this change in wording actually matter or not? So let's talk about core. Right now, and actually forever, a given FHIR instance is only valid against a single version of core. Now, it might actually comply with more than one, but it has to have a single version that it asserts to the world. And there's a few different ways that it can assert that to the world. It can be exposed in the MIME type, so if you're downloading something as an attachment, or you're using content negotiation when you're doing a RESTful call, you can see what the FHIR version is there. You can also look at the capability statement. If you're retrieving something from a RESTful server, that should have a capability statement. It's one of the few things that we actually insist on if you want to call yourself FHIR conformant. And that should tell you what FHIR version you're seeing. And if you're receiving FHIR, say, in an email attachment, and you don't have those other mechanisms available to you, you can actually declare it in the instance. So every instance that you look at will have a version available to you, or at least it should. But as a consumer, you might not care about the version. At least if the resource is normative, you should be able to process the instance irrespective of what version it happens to be. There might be a couple of new data elements that you're not familiar with. So if I send you an R5 version of structure definition, or of patient, or an R6 version, it's possible there could be a couple of extra data elements. If you have set up your code properly, you can happily process that and ignore the elements that you don't recognize, because you can be confident that those elements are not modifiers. They don't change the meaning of anything else that you have. And presumably, if the information is important for the human to see, it should already be present in the narrative. So the general pattern is consume the instance and just ignore anything that you don't recognize. However, if we are in the pre-normative phase, then those bets are off, and the reality is that there isn't a heck of a lot of clinical information that we're sharing right now that is normative. We got patient, we got observation, and that's it. Everything else is infrastructure. However, R6 should change that. And so we will soon be in a world where we can start to behave in a more version-agnostic fashion, and designing your software to manage that is certainly a good thing to try to do. If you're not in the normative space, so you have people who want R4, you have other people who want STU3 or DSTU2, the historical way is, here's my DSTU2 endpoint, here's my STU3 endpoint, here's my R4 endpoint. In R4, we introduced a new mechanism, which is using content negotiation. So you can have a single endpoint and people can ask for what they want, or they could even say, well, I could handle all three of those, but I'd really prefer R4 if you can give it to me, and then request accordingly. When you have those multiple interfaces, you presumably don't have 2 or 3 or however many back-end systems. You've got one database. And so you are surfacing your data, whatever it might be, over those different syntaxes for the different versions. And one of the key messages is to make sure that you have a layer in your software to handle that conversion. Because even if today the only thing that you're surfacing to anybody is R4, because you got on the FHIR bandwagon after DSTU2 or STU3 were even relevant, you came into things when R4 was the only game in town, it's not going to be the only game in town forever. And so you're likely going to face the prospect of needing to surface other versions. And so having code that will be able to translate between however you store things internally, even if you are a FHIR first persistence layer and all your data is R4, you may still need to surface it as R5. Moving to R5 doesn't mean you have to change your data store. It just means that you're changing your external syntax. One of the other considerations is there's changes in what the data is that's possible to share in the different versions of FHIR. And in R4 as well, and then a whole lot of work after that to actually make it work, we have the notion of interversion extensions, which means that we can take a concept that only exists in R5 or R6 and still send it in an R4 interface and have software that recognizes and says, oh, I know what that is, and I can validate according to the R5 rules or the R6 rules or whatever they might be. And that's a really powerful thing because it means that we don't have to wait for the entire world to move to the new version before we can start using that new version content. In terms of managing implementation guides with multiple versions of Core, we, in the implementation guide resource, said it's absolutely desirable and appropriate for us to be able to publish one guide that covers R4 and R5 and R6 and whatever versions people might want. So we have built into the syntax of the implementation guide the possibility of having multiple FHIR versions, and we can even specify for particular profiles or particular operations, this one is good for R4 and R5, this other one is good for R6. But we haven't actually built anything that makes that work. And everybody who writes the code to do IG publishing looked at that problem and went, yeah, we should do that sometime, not now, not this year, probably not next year, because it's hard. Publishing just within a single implementation guide version is hard. The notion of publishing multiple versions simultaneously, managing the validation around that is hard. And I've talked to Graham multiple times and said, I want this. And he said, no. So it will probably happen, because Graham has told me no about lots of other things in the past, and they've eventually showed up. And FHIR has also not expressed great enthusiasm about doing this. But we all respond to market forces, and the reality is we are moving into a market where there's going to be lots of folks that are on R4 and staying on R4 for a while. And there's going to be lots of folks that are moving to R6 and are super excited about that. And we've got people who are going to want to satisfy both audiences, and they're not going to want to publish multiple implementation guides. And so I anticipate that this will come. However, we can't do it right now, so what can we do? Structured data capture, which is one of the guides that I'm responsible for, is focused on questionnaires, is currently focused on R4, because in our market, there aren't a whole lot of people who are interested in R5 yet, and R6 isn't available. But we added some changes to questionnaire, the questionnaire resource in R5, that we kind of wanted to take advantage of. And we also wanted to ease the transition process so that people who were in the R4 space and wanted to be able to interoperate with people who were in the R5 or the R6 space could do that. And the simplest way for us to do that was to look at what are the features that exist in R5, can we put those into R4, include them as expectations in our guide, and then obviously the syntax is going to be a little bit different. In R4 you have to use extensions, in R5 you can do it in core, but that's just software. All of the data is there. And so we went ahead and did that. So the version of SDC that went to ballot and that we'll publish sometime this summer makes use of interversion extensions throughout the IG. I mean, there weren't tons. We did not completely radically change questionnaire, because somebody over there probably would have hit us with things if we had. But we made a couple of enhancements, and we fixed some things that, with the knowledge of lots of implementations, we realized were kind of broken. And so what that looks like, if I just bring it up and make it big enough that hopefully people at the back can see it a little bit. Is we do things like this. So version algorithm is something that got introduced to most or all of the canonical resources in R5, and it is trying to deal with the fact that we didn't tell everybody that they had to use semantic versioning when they do their version numbers. And now this is something that's available for us to use as an introversion extension. So we actually said, you have to support this. You don't have to have one, but you have to pay attention to this. You have to be capable of dealing with it if you want to declare that you are conformant to SDC, even though it's a feature of R5. And we've done that a few different places. We did that for questionnaire, and we did that for value set. Those were the only two that had changes that we really needed to worry about. So now let's talk about implementation guides. This is what caused me to have to worry about versions for real, because R6 was sort of a theoretical thing, but in the US with Da Vinci, we base our implementation guides on US Core because they are all focused on US FHIR requirements. And there's regulations in the US that say, right now, you must do US CDI Release 1, which corresponds to US Core 3.1.1. The numbers have nothing to do with each other. It's marvelous fun. But there is a regulation that also exists that says, in January, everybody has to do US CDI 3. 2 doesn't matter, but 3 matters. And that corresponds to 6.1.0. And then there was proposed regulation that said, in a future January, a couple of years down the road, there was going to be an expectation that everybody was going to move to 7. That didn't make it into the final regulation, but there's been noise about the possibility of a new regulation that's going to force everybody to move to 8. Date yet to be determined. And the problem we have in Da Vinci is payers have to do a ton of work to get our implementation guides live. And the prospect of, well, your guide's going to look like this right now, and then in a year it has to change, and then 2 years after that it has to change, did not go over well. And so we were faced with, well, how do we ease that transition? How do we make it so that they can implement once now and then not worry about the fact that US Core is changing under their feet? Because the other consideration is that payers and EHRs are all going to move to adhere to these regulations in slightly different timeframes. Some of them are already supporting 610. Some of them have plans to support 7.0 real soon. Others, while the regulation says that thou shalt, there's thou shalt, and there's lawyers actually knocking on my door making me. And so there's wiggle room there, and people will move at different speeds. And so we said, can we actually produce a single implementation guide that declares conformance to all 3 of these? And we went and did the analysis in terms of what's happened in the migration between 3.11 and 6.1 and 7. What did they change? And we determined that, yes, we could actually do that. So we had to review every single profile in all 3 versions to see what's changed. In some cases, they actually changed the terminology. So they used to use one code system, and you had to use that. And then they said, actually, the owner of the terminology said, you should not be using this. Go use this other thing instead. And so they changed, which was a good thing. But the old version still says you have to use the old one. And so in order to be compliant with both, we actually have to send both sets of codes, which is a bit of a pain, but Codable Concept is designed specifically to let us do that. And we have a new set of machinery called additional bindings, which allows us to say, you shall send this, and you shall send this, and if we wanted to, we could list 5 others. And to make life a little bit easier for folks, because if you were conformant only with 3.1.1 and weren't sending the new code system, making you send the new code system is work. People don't like to do work, so we tried to save them some effort and said, here's a concept map. So just run this concept map, it'll tell you the new coding to add, and you're off to the races. You don't have to do that analysis yourself. Or for that matter, if you've implemented 6.1 and you never worried about 3.1.1, but now you might be sending to people who care about 3.1.1, run this other concept map, and it'll add the old coding. And so we don't have to worry about that work. The other thing is that on occasion, US Core actually loosened some requirements because they discovered that they were a bit tighter than they necessarily wanted them to be. If you want to interoperate and be valid across all of the profiles, you have to impose all of the constraints of all of the profiles or somebody's going to be unhappy. It turns out that there was only one set of constraints that that happened to us for the resources we cared about, which was on practitioner role. It used to say that you had to send a practitioner in an organization. In the new version of 6.10, they said you have to send at least one of the 2 or send a code. So you could actually not have any of them. But we said for Da Vinci purposes, for the instances that we're communicating, you should always know the organization and the practitioner, so it was reasonable for us to impose that constraint on top. And so we basically put it back. What that looks like in the implementation guide, we have to declare dependencies on all of the versions. So we say we depend on US Core version 7 and version 6 and version 3.1.1. We have to declare an alias because we're bringing in the same package multiple times with different versions of it. And we had some fun tooling trying to make that happen, but that's now all behaving nicely in both the Java world and the .NET world. And what that manifests as is when we look at in the implementation guide, it says we use US Core, and here's the 3 different versions that we use, and here's why we're using them. The other thing that we needed to do is we needed to derive our profiles. Now, with profiles, you can only have one parent. So we can't say that our Da Vinci organization is a specialization of version 7 and 6.1 and 3.1.1. We have to pick one. And so we picked the newest, which is 7. And then we wanted to still say and make it really clear to everybody that, by the way, you are still meeting the regulatory requirement around 6.1 and around 3.1.1. And to do that, we use this complies with profile extension, which lets us say, hey, while we are deriving from 7, the set of constraints that we have, the terminology bindings, et cetera, mean that if you comply with this particular profile, you are also complying with these others. And the validator can actually go through and check to make sure that you are in fact meeting the rules of those additional profile declarations. In doing this, it means that we can, whoever is implementing CRD or DTR or PDEX or whatever other Da Vinci acronym you're choosing to implement, if you comply with that, you no longer care what version of US Core your communication partner is using, and you don't care about the fact that they're transitioning. So if somebody that you're talking to is currently doing 3.1.1, and next week they decide to switch to doing 6.1.0, it doesn't necessarily matter to you, because the data that they're sending is still going to comply with the profiles that you wrote to. Some of the must supports might have changed. So data that was previously absent because they didn't know how to send it is now absent because they don't have the data. And that's going to be true for historical data, even if the net new data that they're capturing does start to populate these elements. You had to handle it being missing anyhow. It also means that as implementers, they don't have to worry about having multiple releases of the Da Vinci IGs. We only have to publish one thing. Readers only have to read one thing. And the validator can check that we are, in fact, doing everything that we claim to be doing. Obviously, this does not come for free. First of all, we had to do the analysis. And we've actually published the analysis of the version comparisons that we did. We didn't compare everything that exists in US Core. We only looked at the things that we were using. But if you wanted to do this for IPS, you would have to analyze those versions. If you wanted to do it for SDC, you would have to analyze those versions. And of course, how well it will work is going to depend a little bit on how radical the changes are between the releases of the implementation guides. If you've got implementation guides that do things completely differently, I mean, you can publish one guide, but you're going to have multiple profiles. And as implementers, you're going to have to handle receiving data that looks like different structures. But if the implementation guides are trying as much as they can to remain backward compatible, then it makes this whole process a lot easier. So it imposes, at least in theory, requirements on the foundational guides to try to behave themselves and not break things too much. It also means that if you are sending data that is compliant with 3.1.1, you are not out of the box going to be compliant with these guides, because we need you to send those translation codes. Or if you're sending 6.1.0, you're not compliant out of the box because we need you to, at least when you're talking to us, to make sure that you have organization and practitioner present. And so there is a little bit of an imposition, but it's a single imposition, and once you do that, you're then good to go as your versions change. One other cost is the more stuff you put into your dependencies list, the more things that the validator needs to cross-check, the longer your builds take. So it does create a more complex publication and design process. Now, right now, Da Vinci is complying with 3 different versions of US Core. And when we adopted this process, one of the questions that came up with So what happens when US Core 8 comes out, or 9, or 10, or whatever? Are you just going to keep building forever? And the answer is no, because I like my builds to finish before I finish my lunch. But also because reality is older versions cease to become relevant. So the regulation that said thou shalt support 3.1.1 will no longer really be relevant once we have passed January, and now everybody has to be on 6.1. And so we will start to fade out those older versions as we add in new ones. Now, the specific time frame for adding in those new versions and fading out the old ones kind of depends on the community and or on regulation, which impacts the community. And so if there is an extension granted that says, well, yes, we did say that you had to get rid of 3.1.1 by January, but enough of you have whined and complained that we're going to give you an extra 6 months or 2 years, or depends how much certain congressmen got donated to or whatever. I don't know how all of that works. I'm a Canadian, I don't have to care. Things can change. And so whatever the community says we need to have in the specification is what's going to be in the specification, but the intention is very much to fade things out when they're no longer relevant, and to add in new things when they become relevant. So based on what's happened with final regulation, 7 doesn't matter so much, and we may end up yanking 7 when we do another release because nobody cares, and we may add 8 if we now have pending regulation that points to that instead. We will see what happens, and we'll do the analysis as necessary. So what does this actually look like in the build? What you see there is from the QA page, and you can see that we are bringing in US Core with an out-of-version declaration, but you can see that the version is 7, and then we have an alias of US Core, v610, which is the 6.10 version, and then way down at the bottom, it almost got cut off, we have 3.1.1, and all of the different dependencies of all of those versions also come in. So that's part of what makes the build slow, is you're bringing in not just US Core, but all of the versions of all of the things that it depended on, including VSAC, which is huge. So if we go take a look at how that actually manifests, HREX is sort of our foundational shared implementation guide. But what we see here, and something weird is happening, I'm declaring in the instance, and it used to show up, but it's not today, so I'll go talk to Graham, we'll figure it out. So my parent is 7, and it says I also comply with 3.1.1. This should say beside this that it also complies with 6.10. It's not saying that, but that's what it shows up as to the reader. Other than that, it's just a regular profile with all of the constraints that happen to be necessary. And then if we go look here in practitioner role, we can see this is the place where we had 2 different terminologies. So we have an extensible binding to the new terminology, which is what we inherit from US Core 7. And then we also have an extensible binding to the old terminology. And we've also tightened down our requirements. We've said that practitioner is mandatory and organization is mandatory. And those things together make this profile one that satisfies the requirements of all of those different releases. So there is utility in supporting multiple different versions, both of the core specification and of parent IGs. You might not be in that world yet, but so long as people continue to care about your implementation guide and care about new things that happen in the world, odds are that you will be in this boat at some point. We don't have an ability to publish implementation guides that support multiple versions of FHIR yet, but we do have the ability to at least prepare for that by creating implementation guides that look to what's happening in the future versions of FHIR and bringing the relevant data elements into the guide. And that's useful just to make the features available, as well as creating a glide path for people to support the new versions when they show up. You cannot have multiple ancestor profiles, but we do have the ability to assert conformance with multiple profiles, and that also makes things easier in terms of letting people prepare for future versions and or maintain support for historical versions. So you can find me there. Hopefully all of you are on chat.fhir.org, which is an even better place to find me because questions that you ask there, everybody can see, and you can hear answers from more than just me, which is generally valuable. So hopefully that was useful, and we do have some time for questions.
If you use the complies with profile extension, does the validator actually pick that up when you validate an instance against the profile? Will it also validate against the others?
Not yet. So Graham has said, yes, I can do that, and yes, I will do that, but for some reason he hasn't had the time.
It's on the list.
But it is on his list of things to do. He has a list. I've seen it. It's scary. So this is not something you would generally do at runtime, but during the publication process, his intention is take all of the examples, and if you say that this example is valid against your profile, and that says, by the way, I'm also valid against those, he'll just cross-check against those other ones as well and make sure that that at least is true. Yeah, like a QA rule in the IG publisher.
Thanks for your talk. I have a question about, like, you had this statement, you said that if a constraint differ, impose the tightest of the constraint, in the US core, right? So basically that means that you are going in two different directions. Like US core decided to relax something, but you said, no, we are not gonna relax it. Isn't that causing some issue? So that's the first question.
Yep.
And the second question is that later on, a few slides later, you said that drive profiles from the most complete of the profiles, right? Usually the latest one. So what if that latest version is the one that relaxes the constraint? So again, like kind of conflict.
Yep. And the answer is, if you want to allow for data to be valid against the old and the new, you can't fully relax the constraints. Now, there's a few options for you. What we chose to do was we just put the constraint back because in our world we wanted that constraint anyhow. If you're in a situation where you only want it in certain circumstances, you could impose it as a conditional constraint. So in certain circumstances, so if you got this code present, then the constraint applies. If this code is not present, then it doesn't apply. So you can play it that way. But in the end, if you want to support all of the versions, you're going to have to meet those rules for some period of time. And that's one of the other reasons to start dropping the older versions once you no longer care about them. I mean, one of the things when we drop off 3.1.1, we probably won't relax the constraint, but we will relax the expectation to send the old codes because we don't really want them. They're only there to support the systems that need them, and we can relax that and remove that cost of needing to do that translation. So there absolutely is a cost to maintaining compliance with multiple versions simultaneously, and you need to evaluate that trade-off. I mean, the other possibilities, you say, I've got two different profiles, and old systems use this, new systems use this. That's a cost too, and so you sort of figure out what's the better place to be.
You had mentioned when talking about supporting multiple versions of the FHIR Core spec to have a way to have the extensions added for older versions of FHIR to support fields that are in newer ones. Mm-hmm. What about going the other direction? Because something I've seen looking at the conversion templates between different versions is there are some steps where it just says, use human discretion. There's no way to automate it.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, if the work group that was responsible for the resource said, that was a fun attempt, we're going to go a completely different direction, then there's limitations to how much you can do. In the end, your advantage as an IG author is you're not trying to cover the entire scope of the resource. You're covering the data elements that you care about for your particular use case. And so you look at the old version of the resource, you look at the new version of the resource, and you say, where do the data elements that we care about live? And in some cases, you will be missing certain core elements in one version or the other. You can use interversion extensions to manage and find a home for everything in both versions. That's your objective, is to find a home. Now, if the resource, you could end up with a situation where old version is all extensions and some extra extensions that say that I don't support these other things that are mandatory. And so technically I'm conformant. In reality, anybody who's trying to consume that as a resource, say in STU3, is going to look at it and go, there's nothing here that I understand. Technically conformant, not usefully interoperable, may not be worth the effort. So think about not only is it technically conformant, but also is a system that's consuming this resource going to be able to do anything useful with it? And if the answer is no, then maybe don't bother trying to maintain support across the versions.
Just a quick one. I wasn't sure whether you were using it FHIR for storage as well, or whether it was just for messaging, but I'm just wondering with regards to resource references, where, say, data was recorded in an older version, US Core 3.1, but then it gets updated, that patient's record gets updated in 6. Have you encountered any issues with the referential integrity there, where it's kind of saying, well, actually, I don't want to update it because I'm expecting a 3.1 practitioner, not a 6 practitioner, or anything like that?
So when you're receiving the data, there is no expectation that's actually going to tell you what profile or profiles it happens to be conformant with. So it's just going to be a practitioner. And you're going to look at it and say, does it meet my requirements? And so long as the system that you're dealing with aligns with the Da Vinci requirements, which says if it's a practitioner role, it needs to have both codes, it needs to have an organization and a provider, we don't necessarily care about the rest of it. We did go through and look at all the dependencies for the things that we had as must support. So there are references that exist to things that are not must support, we don't care about, and we didn't pay any attention to those resources, but we did chase through all the references for the things that we did care about and make sure that all of those profiles did comply with each other and created versions of them. There were a few that we didn't bother to create profiles of. So for example, US Core Patient, 311 and 610 and 7, there were some additional must supports that were introduced and some additional extensions in gender harmony space and stuff like that. We didn't have must support on any of those, so we don't care. And so from our perspective, we didn't need to profile. So long as you meet the US Core Patient expectations for one of those things, we're fine. But that is absolutely part of the analysis you have to do. It's not just the resource you care about, but all of the references that you care about.
Just a comment on a tragic and dramatic case. Request group in FHIR Release 4 was named differently in Release 5. So in that case, there's not much that you can do, because even the resource name is different.
Yeah, well, I mean, if we're talking about interoperability across core versions, we're not looking for syntax validity. We're looking for, can you send the same data elements? Because right now we don't have the ability to publish a profile or publish an implementation guide that covers both. So you're going to say, I'm publishing R4, so it's going to call it request group, I think. I forget which name was which release, because it's the same to me in my head now. And then you can acknowledge the fact that it's going to be a different name, but what you really care about is, do you have all of the data elements that you care about in both? And anybody who wants to then take their R4 instance and send it in R5 or R6 will have to run through a transformation process that will take stuff that was extensions, put it in core, or possibly take stuff that was core and put it in extensions and change names and whatever else. But so long as the data has a clear home, that's less of a problematic exercise. And in tools like the Java tool, it actually has those conversions built in. So if you've got an R4 extension with the interversion extensions in it, it'll just spit out an R5 for some resources, not all of them, but you can do the exercise for the other resources that you care about following the same principle.
Looking at the time, this will be the last question for today.
Thank you, Lloyd. Very useful and actual presentation. My question about what is the exact semantic of complying with if I have multiple? And does it mean and, or it means or, either of this? Because I can imagine I was puzzled for the week with this problem. What if these profiles are incompatible between each other, like versions? So then if I will try to validate all of them, it will fail all the time. Yeah, but if it's or, then it can pass somehow.
So the extension that says complies with is an and. So I comply with the thing I inherit from, and I also comply with all of the other things that I'm declaring. If you're in a situation where you cannot safely declare that, then you're in a position where you have to actually, in your implementation guide, say, if you're doing 311, here's your profile. If you're doing 610 or 710, here's your profile. And you actually need to care who you're talking to, which of those two formats you adhere to. There was a place where we actually thought we were going to need to do that, and that was with Encounter. Because Encounter in 311 said that you're not allowed to have a practitioner role as a performer, and in 6.1 and 7 said that you are allowed to have a practitioner role as a performer, because they didn't understand that when they said practitioner must support, that was actually excluding everything else. And when we explained that to them, they fixed it in the future versions. But what they've done is they put out sort of a technical notice that says, while formally the specification says this, and the validator is going to yell at you, from a conformance testing perspective, practitioner role has always been intended to be accepted here and is fine. And so we looked at that and said, well, if from a certification perspective it's fine, the fact that the validator is going to yell about it, we won't worry about. And so we said, we're not going to create two separate profiles because of that. But if that hadn't been the case, then we would actually have had to have two separate profiles for Encounter, because in that case, we wanted practitioner role. We prefer practitioner role. And so we didn't want to be in a situation where we said practitioner role is prohibited. There isn't a standard extension for similar with ORs, but we can invent whatever extensions we want if we find that it's useful.
Okay, that's it for this session. Thanks everyone for your questions. Feel free to reach out through one of the communication channels Lloyd mentioned. And thank you, Lloyd, for your presentation.